Do you know what you would do if all hell broke loose on your AWS cloud architecture? If you don't, you're in luck, because in today's video, we're going to discuss AWS disaster recovery and the 4 must-know strategies you need to know to make sure that you, your customers, and your business doesn't get completely screwed in the event of a disaster. Now, if you're new here, I'm Greg, creator of Thoughtful Techie Cloud, and each week I create a video to help you navigate your AWS cloud and tech journey. If you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe right now. No, seriously, right now. I'll wait. 3, 2, 1. Cool. Thank you for your subscription. Now, let's dive into what the AWS cloud disaster recovery conversation looks like. And it's not what you think. Most people want to dive right into the technology, and they don't realize that, wait a second, I need to focus on the business first. What are the business requirements? What are the business use cases? And when do we need to recover? And how much data can we afford to lose? So disaster recovery doesn't begin with a technical conversation. It begins with a business conversation. And what that looks like is there are 2 things you need to take a look at. There are 2 terms. One of them is RTO, recovery time objective. Recovery time objective is how long is it going to take us to restore the operations of the service that we're looking at. RPO, recovery point objective, is when we come back and we're operational, how much data can we afford to lose? Now, the general rule of thumb is the faster you want to bounce back from an engineering standpoint, the more complex it is. How much data that you can afford to lose, if you can't afford to lose no more than 15 minutes of data, that's a different conversation than we can afford to lose 1 hour worth of data. So with both of those, the tighter those constraints are, the more engineering complexity it is, and the more costly it could be in terms of how much it's going to cost for that disaster recovery option. Now, what drives the RTO and the RPO requirement? Can it be a short timeline, or can it be an extended timeline? That's when you need to speak with the business. That's why I was telling you, disaster recovery is always a business conversation first. Now, you can look at the applications, work with the customer, and they're going to need to tell you, okay, this particular application is customer facing. What would happen if it were to go down, right? What if it were to stay down for 24 hours? Would there be an impact? Who would notice? Who would get upset? How much revenue would the business lose? These are some qualifying questions that you would need to ask the business in order to work backwards from there to figure out what does a technical requirement in terms of disaster recovery look like. So if you're working with a bank, for example, and they're like, you know what, we cannot afford to be down for 24 hours. We can only take a 15-minute outage. That solution, of course, is going to be more complex from an engineering standpoint, and it's going to cost more. Or let's say, your customer's running an ice cream shop, and there's an outage, and their website goes down, which has their ability to do pre-orders for ice cream, and it has the menu so people can take a look at the menu before they arrive at the ice cream shop. Maybe they say, okay, we can afford for our website to be down for an hour because, we might not get those online orders, but at least we can get that foot traffic. So the ice cream shop is willing to make what's called a trade-off in saying that, we're willing to spend a little bit less on our disaster recovery solution because they've taken a calculated risk to say, we don't want to pay all this money for the disaster recovery because we can afford to be up and operational within an hour because those customers that are coming into the shop, walking in, will subsidize all the ones that we will potentially lose in those online orders. Now, again, back to that recovery point objective in terms of data. Going back to the bank scenario, banks can't afford to lose any data, right? So if there are transactions coming in, if there are checks that need to clear, If we lose that, it can cause big problems. So recovery point objectives for a bank, for example, are going to be extremely tight. Can't afford to lose much data, if any data at all. And the cost to achieve that and the complexity from an engineering standpoint will match with their requirement. Now, I want to round off this video to jump into those 4 strategies, right? Now that we understand what recovery point objective is, RPO, recovery time objective, RTO, now we can look at the architectures that will support this. So this can be, I'll pop this up here on the screen. They're called AWS disaster recovery strategies. And this is one of my favorite charts to look at. So we're going to look at this from left to right, starting up with backup and restore. Now, if you notice the RPO and the RTO hours, this is going to be for lower priority use cases. Think about that ice cream shop scenario that I mentioned earlier, right? This will allow you to provision all AWS resources after the event, and then you can restore backups after the event. The cost for this is, minimal compared to the other solutions that we're going to go over. Now, where this comes into play is with any customer or business that you're dealing with that says, you know what, the most important thing for us is to have the data. If we have an outage, we can afford to take the time that it needs to restore from our backups. Once we restore from our backups, then we can work to get up and operational. Now, the timeline to get back up and operational for a backup and restore architecture pattern, it could be several hours, could be even days, depending on what type of data we're looking at. But if the business in this particular use case decides, hey, that's what they can do, then the backup and restore is something that you could advise them to move forward with. And they would save money from doing that in terms of the solution that backs up. But they'd have to weigh out the cost of any potential business or revenue that they would lose while they're down. But that's a business decision that they would make. Now, moving over to Pilot Light. Pilot Light is a really interesting one that cloud really enables. Pilot Light is for where the RPO and RTO starts to get a bit more strict. Now, it's still not too crazy, right? So this would be, okay, you know what? We can do tens of minutes in terms of our recovery point objective and recovery time objective. Now, this would basically stand up a small skeleton footprint that would handle data replication. The services might be idle in terms of what you want to spin up. So you have just a small footprint of your services that are spun up and always ready to go, but not the full scale operation to take on all the traffic. So what would happen is that if you have an outage, then this would trigger the pilot light to start a full flame, so to speak, and then your architecture comes up. Now, you could provision, as I mentioned, some of your AWS resources and scale after the event. And the cost to do this is, there's a couple of dollar signs here, so it goes up more compared to the pilot light that we mentioned earlier. Now let's talk about a warm standby. This is going to be for recovery point objectives and recovery time objectives that start to measure in the minutes. So notice those RPOs and RTOs are getting a bit more aggressive. This is going to be an architecture that's always running, but it's still a little bit smaller, so maybe you're not fully auto-scaled all the way out. Because remember, warm standby, it's warm and up and ready, but it's still not actively handling traffic, right? This would be for, I would say, critical business applications that, again, the business decides. And then when you have an outage or some sort of disaster, then the business would scale those AWS resources to full capacity. And in doing so, relative to our pilot light and our backup and restore, the money goes up to build out this disaster recovery solution. Now, for our final architecture strategy for disaster recovery, multi-site active-active. This is where we go from hours, tens of minutes, all the way down to we don't want any downtime, right? So literally zero downtime. So this is for the most aggressive recovery point objectives and recovery time objectives. For instance, a bank application. This is zero downtime. This is near zero data loss, and then mission critical services. So think about your highest priority applications. I mean, think about like the Amazon.coms of the world, multi-site, active. Think about the Netflixes of the world, some of the services that you know and love. This is where they're using the multi-site, active. Now, as you can imagine, the cost to pull this off is going to be way more expensive than, let's say, a backup and restore or a pilot light. But as I mentioned, the business drives these conversations. It was a pleasure going over these architecture strategies with you for disaster recovery. Hope you have a better understanding of RPO, RTO, and how to talk with your customers, business, or just have a better understanding of how AWS disaster recovery works in the cloud and the type of conversations you would need to have to be able to sort out what's the right architecture to deliver the best disaster recovery solution. If you have any questions, go ahead and pop them in the comments. If you haven't already subscribed, do it right now, and I'll see you in the next video.